Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth-generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. I want to dive back in with my dad as the guest in the studio today, or the office rather, and just talking back, building upon these episodes that we've had earlier. He joined me and we talked about the history of Ruskamp Farms, what got us to where we are today, and kind of our legacy, and talking about previous generations. It's a really valuable episode, a couple episodes back, so if you haven't listened to that one, go check it out. And then building upon the episode that I just recently did, talking about the 1980s farm crisis. And so that's why I really want to get him in here because, he graduated college right around that early 1980s. And so really want to continue talking about what that was like going through the 80s at that time of his life, and then build upon, what our farm was like back then. We actually had purchased a farm out of the 1980s, which was probably a little bit unusual from most cases. And so just really want to dive back in. So thanks, Dad, for joining me back in today. And as we dive into this, and we basically dive back into the 1980s.
Thanks.
So yeah, I guess, as we got to thinking about some things after our initial episode that we did, talking about the place that he lives on, and we call it Tom's Place because that's where he lives. A piece of ground, 80 acres, was actually purchased in mid-1980s. Sounds like it was about 1986 when our family had purchased that. My grandma and grandpa had purchased that. And so that was, like I said, a lot of times probably going through the middle, like the heart of the farm crisis, maybe towards the end of it, but, really talking about the hardships. And we purchased that from basically a foreclosure, a product of the 1980s farm crisis. And so go ahead and share a little bit about, what you can remember from those days. Let's take this maybe a step back. When you graduated college in 1981, what were they telling you in school about college? And as far as coming back to the farm, what did that look like? What was your thoughts as you were coming back into early 1980s and different things that you remember seeing?
Well, graduated high school in 79 and went to a Northeast Tech Community College, graduated there in 1981, Associate in Applied Science degree in agriculture. And at that time, I believe they were saying that you should kind of not diversify as much, but try to get specific in one field or another is kind of what they were talking about. So not to say that diversified wasn't in the picture. So graduating in 1981, we decided to get a little bigger into hogs and stuff. We were farrow to finish, and we built a nursery and farrowing barn that was in the early 1980s. And then we built a finishing barn in 1981, I believe. And that was on a farm that's actually between where Garrett and I live right now, is the finishing barn was there. And then that was a modified open front at that time. We added a mix mill 2 years later, a feed mill to grind the feed for that place. And then we go into talking about the purchasing of my place, I guess.
So back in college, saying to basically get less diversified, more specialized. So did you kind of take that to heart when you came home, or did Grandma and Grandpa have some resistance about that? Or did you, it sounds like you got bigger in the hogs. Was that kind of your way to specialize, or what did you take to what you learned from college?
That was kind of what we did, was get a little bigger in the hogs and that. But what I found with that was that if you had 150 hogs, they wanted you to get to 500. And if you had 500, then they kind of said the next plateau is 1,000 and then up to 5,000. And then we just didn't have the manpower on the farm, When you use your kid power, if you want to say it that way, your family, the people living in the family, working off the farm that way and stuff. So we just decided that we kind of hit a plateau there, but we did end up going, we had cows, and we were still diversified at that time yet, really, because we had cows, we had sows, we had corn, beans, oats, alfalfa, different crops and stuff. So, yeah, we were still diversified and probably still searching for that one specialized field, but for now we were diversified.
Okay. So then I guess, I cut you off. You start talking about buying your place up there. Tell me about how that all went down, how that kind of came about, and really that whole situation there.
We really weren't looking to purchase anything at the time, but it sat right next to where that finishing barn was and right next to our ground. And we just kind of thought about it, and we said, it was 160 acres went up for sale. And at that time, the bank said no. They said it wouldn't cash flow. It wouldn't work. So we kind of stepped back a little bit, and we said, let's see if we can't make this work somehow. So we had 40 acres that we owned that was off, of this. It was in the neighborhood, but we decided to sell that to my cousin. And between selling that and not buying the 160, but just buying the 80 acres, I think the whole 160 that time would have went for $900 an acre. And this was back in 1986, and just didn't know if we could chew the whole thing off and everything. So we just decided to go possibly with 80 acres, or just go with the 80. That had the house, machine shed, and had a feedlot on it, and the house was better than the one we were living in. And so we decided just to go with that. And I believe the purchase price for the 80 acres was like $1,200 an acre instead of the $900. And it was a foreclosure. We never wanted to go about buying it in that route, but, somebody's going to buy it, You never wish that on anybody, in my opinion. So we decided to do some horse trading, and we kind of sold this piece of ground to buy that. And shortly after that, hogs kind of went through the roof and prices got really good. And I believe we paid for it within 2 years.
It's just kind of an interesting time there. So the people we bought it from was another Rust camp, actually. Mm-hmm. I'm not exactly sure how that relatives, probably not necessarily first cousin, but cousins down the line, I'm sure. And so you can maybe explain more about that, but explain what he used the place for. And I don't want to, like I said, prey on his situation, but you do want to talk about basically how he got to where they did have to foreclose. So I don't know if you recall kind of how that all kind of came about there.
He had about 1,000-acre feedlot, if I remember right. And then supposedly they had a large family, and with the boys they had in the family, they just said they couldn't, support all the boys on that. And I'm not sure if the cattle got them into trouble or what actually, got them to where they were at. So
it sounds like, there was some sort of foreclosure, or the bank came in, had to repossess, or whatever the case was there. So was that, pretty public knowledge? Was there a lot of interest in that ground? Did you have to be like the first ones in to kind of buy it up? Was it private, or what was that like?
It wasn't auctioned off. It was just kind of it's hard to explain how you would have sold at that time. It was
almost like a private treaty bid.
Yeah, they this is what they wanted or something like that. And so we kind of came in and said, yeah,
Okay. So then back to like the place themselves, Loomer and all that. So you said they had an equipment auction, you mentioned? Or?
Yeah, they had an equipment auction, and they auctioned everything, Do
you remember going to that? What was that like?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, those are never fun, because when you're forced to foreclose or forced to sell, you just don't like to do that, and you want to be there to support the family through the tough times and everything. But, and like I say, I just never liked to go about things like that. That just never was us. But since it was right there and somebody's going to buy it, why not make it part of our operation?
Right. And so like even, I guess, like the equipment that time, was it fairly reasonable? Do you remember it? Like it says, was it just average prices, or I guess what do you remember from that?
I think most of it went fairly reasonable. Times were tough, so people couldn't afford a lot.
And then, like I said, in that same instance, you must have been able to survive the farm I know some of that's kind of hard to recall, but like the early 1980s must have been able to survive that somewhat. And then to even go to the bank, even with trading 40 acres for 80, you're still biting off of a chunk of change, still taking some risk. Obviously, the bank was willing to kind of go along with that, or do you remember kind of what those conversations were like?
Well, like I say, the bank said it wasn't, cash flow. With the prices of everything at the time, they said it wasn't going to work. But we just decided, like I say, with that 40 acres and everything, to sell that and then get our debt down a way, get the price down a ways anyway, or help out.
Sure. Well, yeah, and I guess our situation, talking about this, might be a little bit different than, like I said, the previous conversation, talking about the 1980s and all those that went out of business, or some of those. I mean, it just kind of depends on the area that you were in, how bad it actually was. But, really just wanted to kind of dive back into, basically how we came about purchasing that piece of ground and how it was basically through the 1980s farm crisis. And so from that, like you said, sounds like hogs did pretty good and, things turned around, and by luck, I mean, obviously we're still here today, right? And so I guess any kind of additional comments as you came out of the 1980s, purchased that piece, and then even kind of gone into the 90s, any additional comments kind of around that era there?
Well, you just kind of dug in and you did, the most you could with what you had, and tried to do as much as on your own without outside help.
Right. And so I guess my kind of closing comments on that, the farm place and whatnot is, so, we purchased that in 86, and then it wasn't long after that, got into early 1990s, and we had, the tornado came through. Was that 1990?
1991. The tornado came through, and yeah, I took 2 machine sheds and a hog barn, and it didn't bother the house at all, but there was a garage north of the house, and kind of shifted that on the foundation a little bit. And then after that, we tore both machine sheds. One, there was a chicken barn there. How it didn't mess with the house. And all of our stuff went south, where the neighbors crossed on the south end of the section. His went north. So some say it was a straight line wind, but you would think straight line wind, everything would have went in the same direction. Well, ours going south and his going north, it was... We were fortunate enough that we were in the basement and everything. We survived the storm, but when I came out of the basement, I said I can see a disc in the other machine shed, and I shouldn't be able to see that without the other machine shed being gone. So we had, neighbors came around and relatives, family, and everything, and we got cleaned up after that and built a different machine shed and tore that other one down. So after cleanup,
was it the big, I guess, horse barn or the hog barn, was that there during that time?
The horse barn was there, yeah. That survived it all right, too. Like I say, there was another hog barn below that one. It just laid that down on its side. And
did you have a lot of hogs there at the time, too?
Yeah, there was hogs there. I think we lost about 7 of them or something at the time. And the machine shed, it was kind of interesting because it was a 40 by 80 machine shed. It had wood posts on it, and it basically sucked it off of everything in it. So nothing underneath was hurt. In fact, we kind of kidded because we had a battery charger on top of a weed sprayer, and it never messed with that at all. And you had to kind of picture it because there was a machine shed and then another machine shed, and then we had the 40 by 80 machine shed, and then there was probably like a 25 by 30 machine shed that leveled that. There was a feed shed on blocks. And then there was the chicken barn next to it that just laid that down. The feed shed on blocks never moved. How that all works, I have no idea. That's just one of those weather things we'll never understand.
Sure. I just remember stories about that because that was before my day, but just interesting seeing pictures from the place prior to and then afterwards. And then obviously we rebuilt and things have changed since then. So yeah, that's always interesting how different weather events come through and change the landscape. So yeah, I guess while I got Dad here, the other thing we didn't necessarily talk about on our first episode was to really dive into the details of Ruscamp Farms and when we went through our large expansion in 2016. So for most of you that know or have listened to prior episodes, I've talked about that and I've gone into some more details from my side of things. And, the different challenges that we faced and where I was at kind of at my point in life. But, since I got Dad here on the mic, wanted to kind of get his take on things. So just for a little bit of context real quick, back in 2016 is when we built a big hoop building up on Dad's place on that same 80 acres that we're talked about that we purchased in the 1980s. And so with that, like I said, we built a big hoop building, and the intention was to put cows and calves in there and calve in there. And at that same time, we had actually expanded our cow herd we were at about 150 cows prior to that, and then we went up to 300. So basically doubled our cow herd. And 2016, that was a time when, to buy the cows, they were fairly reasonable, but as far as the cattle market goes, it wasn't a great time. It wasn't always the best, but I guess with that expansion, we went into and we expanded the cow herd, put up the infrastructure. We also put up a commodity shed for hay, and bought a couple pieces of equipment, nothing major, but a lot of that added up and really added up to, a lot of debt. And prior to that, Ruskamp Farms, we'd been pretty conservative, didn't necessarily have a lot of debt. And so we had the capabilities to do this, but it was a big chunk of change that we bought. We kind of bit off, and really changed the landscape from a financial perspective of Ruskamp Farms. And so as we go into kind of later into 2018, 2019, and we're just kind of struggling financially to get on top of the debt. Things weren't probably structured the way that they should have been, and things added up really fast. A lot of interest payments came due. Line of credits were, kind of getting maxed out because, like I said, we expanded so much, so fast. And I could go into a lot of detail there, but, as we went through those different challenging times, all of a sudden we're having meetings with the bank more frequently, and even meetings with the lawyer, like what can we do here? What are our options? And even meetings with people from the farm hotline. And that kind of it really ties back to, like I said, the farm crisis in the 1980s, because that's actually where that farm hotline kind of came from. That was developed back in the 1980s for those people going through, quite frankly, a similar situation to what we were in. But, the difference between the 1980s and now when our farm kind of went through the crisis of our own, was we didn't have neighbors that were going through the same thing, or this wasn't a big event, which was good. Don't get me wrong. It was good. But when you're going through it, you feel so isolated, like you're the only one that's dealing with this challenge. And there kind of comes with a certain amount of pressure and weight with that itself. And so I say all this as kind of a backstory to kind of Dad bringing his perspective as to going through that, and just wanted to let him share. Interestingly enough, before I let him share, I can't remember the exact year that we did this, but it wasn't long after we built the building and we started kind of going through these hard times. Somewhere probably around 2017, 2018, we actually I think it was 2018, we did a documentary series for AFAN, the Alliance for Future of Agriculture in Nebraska. And that was, basically on our hoop building, how we had expanded to try to get me back to the operation, which was the primary reason that we did that, truthfully. And so we did a documentary series talking about it. And after it was released, we kind of knew some of the pain and challenges, times that we were going through. And it's one of those deals where, yes, it was good to see that documentary, and it was cool and it was enlightening, but we also knew the challenges that it was putting upon our family and our legacy even. And so it was one of those I wouldn't say were necessarily in 100% integrity when we did that, but it was just something that we got asked to do, and we went ahead and we did it. And now we look back and probably to some extent wish we would not have done it, because we're both pretty truthful people, and we want to be honest with our situation. And so that's part of why I share about it and share about the different challenges we went through, and ultimately to help other people. So I've been talking a lot, and the reason we got Dad here is for him to share. So take it away. I guess I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but kind of tell me what it was like. What was your thought process as we did expand, kind of go through the building that? What was your intentions? And then we'll kind of go from there.
Well, you go back to specializing and everything, and we were struggling with the hogs. It seemed like we had a lot of disease problems and everything. And Garrett had been in 4-H, and he was kind of showing livestock and cows, and he showed an interest in that. So by that time, he had some cows and calves. I had some cows and stuff. We were building a herd there, and then the farms had their own herd too, our numbers and all this. And so we looked at possibly doing a hoop barn, and we had toured different people who had did different kinds of hoop buildings, whether it was steel or wood or what it was. So we kind of checked it out, and we kind of really put a bunch of numbers together and put it under a microscope and said, boy, you know what, if we do this, we could maybe make something like this work, and the barn was like a 40 by 350, I think, 45, something like that by 350. And anyway, the barn itself would hold 150 cows, so we thought, well, that's cool. We were struggling with outside weather once in a while in the spring with scours and different issues there. So we thought, well, let's put up a barn like this and that'll take care of that, Well, unfortunately, we took the outside problems and moved them inside. The weather in this barn, this particular style of barn, was only as good as the weather on the outside, And Garrett had talked about possibly going to, more cows and everything. So we went from 150 cows up to 300. We doubled the size of the herd. We did a spring and fall. We thought, well, that'll spread out our, income as well. And in fact, we even thought about, well, what if we could turn the barn 3 times, So we were up to 450 cows at one time. And it seemed like if we weren't breeding, we were calving and giving shots and preg checking and everything. We really put a lot into it. And we knew there was going to be a lot of sweat equity in it. But the cows poured out more manure and it took a lot of bedding to do this. And Garrett had talked about the equipment we bought. One of the things was a bale processor to blow the corn stalks into the building and everything, which, like I say, again, we looked back, we did all the numbers and everything. There might have been some hidden numbers we just didn't see, but in the end, these big cows made a lot of poo, and it takes a lot to clean that out and it takes a lot of bedding for it. And when you take the bedding off of the ground, we had the corn stalks and wheat straw and straw off of our own fields, but you got to put it back out there again, So it took equipment to clean the barn out. It took equipment to haul the manure and everything like that. And then in the process, we got into this embryo transfer thing. We thought, well, that looked like a pretty good deal. If we could gain $400 a head or something at the time, that look at what $100, $400 on that amount of head would do, But the numbers just didn't add up at the time. The conception rates were low. They were just all over the board. We do decent on one herd or one group, and then the next one we just couldn't do nothing right, it seemed like. And seemed like we had a lot of health issues with those, it seemed like. And so, yeah, we just kind of went from this and that. And then back to the weather thing again. We had another weather event, and was it 2000 and...
It was 2019.
2019. We had a windstorm go through, and that might have been more of a straight line wind, but I was away from home at that time, and when I came back, I came on the place, and I thought, oh, good, the hoop building survived it, but as I got closer, I noticed the east end had been tweaked. In fact, every arch in the building was tweaked. It was a steel building, and it eventually came down, but it was a slow process. It wasn't like everything fell on top of it,
I guess that was when the weather event came down that messed up the hoop building. That was 2022. I thought you were going to be talking about 2019 was when we were calving a whole bunch of bred heifers.
Oh, yeah.
That we had bought when we had expanded that third group. We had bought bred heifers, 150 of them. I think there's actually 160 of them. We bought those and we were calving in January for like a 2-3 week time frame. They were bred really tight. 2019 was when the bomb cyclone came through. That spring was when Nebraska had a lot of flooding, and we had a lot of death loss just from the calves alone that year, which kind of compounded to everything else that we were dealing with on the financial side. So I thought that's where you were going, but yeah, lots of things there to really talk about.
Out of those 150 head, we lost probably 25 head, and it wasn't that we just didn't try, it was, we were around the clock. Garrett was living a mile away, and it was hard for him to get to my place, and my brother was living in Schuyler at the time, for him to come up was kind of tough. So put a lot of weight on my shoulders, and not that I didn't try. We were trying at every one. And some of these heifers ended up being on the mean side. They wanted to kill you more than they were protecting their calf. They were doing their thing. So if you've ever heard of a bomb cyclone, when you're going through something like that, it'll put a chill up your spine. We had fiercely cold weather, snow to the point where, like I said, Garrett couldn't get over there. It was blizzard, and So we lost a lot of ears, and even though we tried to protect them and dry them off as much as we could, we'd take them out of the building as soon as they hit the ground and put them in a calf heater up in the shop, and then try to get them back together again. And sometimes calving heifers can be easy, and sometimes it can be rather challenging. And this time it ended up being more of a challenge, and especially that time of year.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to, a lot of things to discuss there, so thanks for kind of sharing your perspective. But I wanted to kind of go back to prior to building the hoop building. We talked about running numbers, kind of share what you want, I guess. But as far as running numbers go, is that just kind of relying on the bank, or you putting as much numbers together as you could and then letting somebody else work with it? Or did you truthfully feel going through with that kind of expansion, taking on that amount of debt, that as long as we worked hard, we'd be fine, we'd be able to work ourselves out of this, and kind of that mentality? What was it like for you as we looked to basically take on that debt to essentially get me back to the operation?
We went to our feed company at the time, and we had the guy do numbers and everything. And I mean, we tried to be as conservative as we could. And like I say, it just, for whatever reason, the numbers didn't add up somehow. But actually, when we took the numbers to the bank from what the feed company had showed us and everything, and the numbers we truthfully thought were as accurate as we could be, the banker looked at the numbers and said, if you're going to build a pad for the barn, why don't you make it big enough for 2 of them right away? That way you can, expand and then bring Garrett back into the operation and go from there, and then, like I say, we, at the time, we figured we needed about $1,200 a head per calf to break even on it with the building costs and everything. And at that time, I think we were closer to $900 to $1,000 on per calf when we sold them. So between, the death loss being high and conception rates with the embryo thing being low and just the low calf prices and everything, it was a perfect storm for, a disaster. And like you said, back then I was 10 years younger. I was in the early 50s or late 50s, and I said, I think I got 10, 20 years left in me yet and stuff. So I'm going to put everything I can into this. And it does take a toll on you, and you're going through it with the family and everybody else. You're not going through this alone. It's a family thing when you're going through it. So when times are good, it's easy. But when you struggle, that's when you find out what your faith is made of and what the whole farming thing is. Where are your priorities? What do you really lean on and stuff? And we did. We leaned on we had our vets in there. We had our feed company in there. We had everybody on board. And it just seemed like it was an uphill battle.
Yeah, kind of going back to the comment that you made as far as the banker said, build the pad big enough for 2. We did that. And we moved a lot of dirt. Where we put this building, we had to move a lot of dirt just to begin with. And so we thought, well, we're doing the dirt work, just as well do it now. It'll be cheaper to do it now versus add on to it later. So we did that. I can't remember how big the pad was, but like I said, the building itself was roughly 40-ish feet by 360. And then so if you add, maybe 40 feet on either side of that, and then you had to have, I think it was roughly 80 or 100 feet between buildings if you built another one. So it was a huge pad. We moved a lot of dirt work. I think that bill was around $40,000 to $50,000 just for the dirt work alone. And so, that's things that added up that you don't necessarily recoup when you do all that dirt work. Sure, it was nice to stack bales up there and do other stuff like that, but that's just kind of going back to some of those things that I don't want to say we were naive, but you kind of probably to some extent naive in that, oh yeah, let's just do this for 2. It'll work itself out, right? And so that's some of the things that I feel like I remember, and maybe your memory is different than mine, but I feel like in a lot of times we were kind of naive in some of the different things that we expanded at the time. Maybe just because we weren't exposed to having everything worked out prior to that, right? We've worked hard. The generation before, you worked hard. Yeah, you expanded, but you were able to work yourself out of that. Within the hogs, we expanded how many different times and built buildings, and they paid themselves off, and we were fine. And this particular reason, whether it be the extent of it, the amount that we expanded, the debt that we did incur, I'm not exactly sure as the case there, but it was just different. And so ultimately, a lot of things added up, a lot of hitting costs came in, All of a sudden we get to where we're not paying our bills. We're sitting in the banker's office, not sure what he's going to say. Are we going to continue to farm on? What does this actually look like in the future? I guess if you remember, what were some of those conversations like? What was the thoughts going through your head as we're working like a dog, trying to get this thing to go and just not working?
Well, you always kind of hope that it rights itself, and a lot of farming is on cycles, it goes up and it goes down, and maybe we just hit the wrong side of the cycle or what it was, or this just wasn't meant to be for us. Yeah, going through that with the meetings with the banker and everything, you just don't want to do that, Like I say, everything was, the harder you worked, the more you made and everything, and this thing, it just seemed like the harder you worked, the more we struggled. And I always tell Garrett, the only mistakes we make are the ones we don't learn from, and yet we're looking back and we still don't know how we got to this point. So we put the hoop building up that time, and I think the cost was $360,000. When that windstorm went through, it was post-COVID and everything, costs have gone up. When that windstorm came through, to replace just the roof and the end walls would have cost $320,000. The prices had gone up just that much. And the building itself cost $7,000 a year to insure. So it was just like, you really got to step back then and look, is this the direction you want to go? And looking at that, I wish we probably would have went with a different style of barn, but at the same time, this barn probably would work really good for 400-pound calves, feeding them in there, wouldn't take near the bedding and everything, but we're all talking hindsight right now, so now we're trying to get our feet back underneath us and figure out what direction the farming operation is going to go.
The other thing I'll say when it comes to, we did learn lessons along the way. It's not like we didn't learn anything, but, as far as when we built this hoop building, talking about like a long 80 in the middle of the section, that's what we had purchased back in 1986, right? And the place is set off of there almost a quarter mile, or maybe not quite, but it's set off the road a little bit. And then we've got some yards. And then basically this building wasn't in the middle of the section, but it was, pretty close to the middle of the 80 anyways. And that's where we built it. It was up on the hill. That was the levelest spot we had on the farm because there's kind of some rolling hills. And that's just felt like a good place. And it was a good place. It flowed with the rest of our yards. We made it work. But with that being said, and this is something that I advise everybody as we kind of shift this conversation to what lessons we've learned and how you guys can pull away the listener to some of the different things we've been through, is when investing in infrastructure like that, there's a lot of things to factor and really consider. And one of those sometimes should be that exit strategy in the event that maybe you need to, say, sell this. Maybe it doesn't work. That's one luxury we did not have. If this would have been like a hog barn built on a corner of a pivot or on a road that nobody gets used or something like that, it probably could have been parceled off and sold and maybe kind of restructured some things and done some adjustments there. Not saying that would have been easy, would have been fun, but that would have been an option. Whereas this is sitting on the place that Dad lived on, that was not an option. That's something that we could not have done. And so I throw that in there just because it's important to remember those things as we invest into infrastructure. So I guess last kind of question here, kind of hitting back to the hard times. I know we keep talking about this, but as we're sitting there in those meetings with the banker, the farm crisis and everything else that we went through there, those conversations, trying to figure out how to make this thing a go. What was your thoughts? Was there ever a concern of like, is this worth it? Are we going to be able to carry on? What did we do? Did you regret anything, or share what that was like? As vulnerable as you want to be, I guess.
Yeah, I know. That was, you never have failure on your mind and everything and stuff. So you always figure there's a way out of this somehow. And so, yeah, you kind of hope that you come out of it, but you don't know. And now where we're at, I mean, our house sits on the 80 acres with the farm. And so we've got everything leveraged against it. And we're still not sure what the future is going to bring. So we're just hoping and praying, I guess. That's all. And yeah, I don't wish that on anybody. I hope, like I say, we can learn from these things, but we'll see what tomorrow brings.
Right. And so I guess as we kind of get to rounding this out, and this is why I wanted to bring this on today, because kind of that last part of what you just said is hoping and praying that it all works out, I feel like is pretty common. And maybe you're listening to this and you've never been in that position, and that's awesome. But I feel like for a lot of people that have gone through hard times, you look at most operations to some extent or another, somebody within the legacy of the operation, at some point, somebody was probably broke or dang close or went through their hardships or had their rough time in the 80s, or maybe it was even prior to that, back into the 30s or something like that. Or everybody at one shape or another has had to go through their hardship. And if you haven't, it's very likely that it could be coming down the line for you. It's just something that I feel like we've witnessed, and a lot of people have had to just go through their hardship in one form or another. So as we share about this, wishing that something would change, things would turn around, the cycle would flip, and we'd be back on the positive side of things, thinking about how I just would hoping something would come and save us. I feel like these are the common thoughts that a lot of farmers and ranchers and business owners tend to have from time to time. And so we don't share this asking for sympathy or, looking down on us any sort of extent there, but sharing and knowing that people are not alone if they've been there, or, might be there in the future. And so that's ultimately why we share this. But then truthfully, as we get into, like I said, rounding this out, this is the reason as we bring about this conversation, the challenging times that we went through, this is the reason why, I started Pioneer Farmer, why we started the Pioneer Mindset podcast, is to bring these vulnerable conversations up to people that, like I said, maybe don't have an outlet, maybe are in that situation right now. And so making sure that we are learning from the lessons, shifting our mindset, and pioneering a new path as we focus on the future to do the best that we can for ourselves, for our operation, for our family, for the legacy that comes down the line. And ultimately, that's where we're at today. Our operation has changed even since 5 years ago when all of this kind of played out. And so we are still in a good position, still moving ahead, still learning from our lessons, and still plowing ahead and moving forward. And so with that, I do thank Dad for coming on and being vulnerable and talking about this. Do you have any lessons that you kind of learned through all of that? Anything that you advise people? Any kind of closing thoughts as we round this out today?
Well, one thought that went through my mind is, it wasn't long ago Ruscamp Farms was in the top 25%. The banker looked at us as we were top of the line. The numbers and everything looked really good. And then how we got to this point, it does happen. Like Garrett said, we don't wish it on anybody, but can it happen? Yeah. I didn't think it could ever happen to us, but reality sets in and it is. But you try to dig in and you cut corners, but just live without things. I look back to the people who lived through the 30s, and I say, they looked like pretty normal people after they got through all that. And I'm sure we'll come out of this all right too, it's just going to probably look a little different, but you learn to live without the things that you think you need. What are the things you want and what are the things you need are two different things. So try to get by now and talk about these things, what can you live without? What do you need, And to me, that really kind of goes back to faith. You can take a lot of things, but if you take the faith out of the picture, that to me is a game changer. So I'm going to stick with that. My grandpa and grandma were like that. My dad was like that, and I'm going to stay with that. So we're going to try to keep doing what we can, and we'll see how this comes out.
Yeah, and I guess good kind of closing comments there. The one thing that you did mention that kind of sparked my interest was saying how we were in such a good position, and then things just changed. And that's where I advise anybody that listens to this is, things can flip. Maybe you think you're in a good position, so you take on the debt or you do something, you expand. And it just doesn't take much these days. One wrong move, one turn of the markets, one black swan event, or one event can sometimes change everything. And so that's why I advise people to do due diligence, try to back up your emotions with the logic or the facts of the numbers. Do your due diligence there. And so, yeah, that's really, I guess, about all I have for today. I do thank Dad for coming on here and sharing. And as we talk more about this, and we look forward to future episodes, maybe bringing them on again as we talk about different things. But for this episode today, that's about all I have. If you have any closing comments, otherwise we'll round this out.
Yeah, no, I'm just like I say, we say the only mistakes we make are the ones we don't learn from. So, and if anybody else can learn from this, that's more power too. That's where we're about, I guess.
Absolutely. So that's all I have for today on this week's episode. We'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more Follow me on Instagram at Garrett Ruskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more Conviction Through Clarity.